Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, and Happy New Year's Eve. I'd like to talk about a new series about middle game strategy and winning middle games. Now, this is from a game from 2016 of the Norway chess between Magnus Carlsen and Vladimir Kramnik. Magnus Carlsen played this very instructionally, and we're going to talk about this. So Carlsen played what? He played d4, d4, and Kramnik played d5, c4, e6, knight c3, and knight f6. Now it looks like the queen's gambit declined because it did not take on c4 on move 2 or on move 3. So you can actually do that even on, on move 3 that's delayed queen's gambit, the delayed queen's gambit accepted, and the regular queen's gambit accepted after d4, d5, c4. You usually would play, one way is to play d takes c. After c6 and knight c3, there's another one where you play, I believe there's this takes. But anyway, knight f6. Now, you have the exchange variation, which plays into the style of Magnus Carlsen, as he is a positional player. So he plays c takes d, e takes d, because you want to control e4. Right, you want, and then he also has this idea of playing bishop e4, knight e4, although easily defended with queen c2. You can kick the knight with f3, but that's what he played. So with this, the idea is we want to both are vying for control of the d5 square, and also for the e4 square. White now plays bishop g5, which is instructive for the opening because that is the best move. It is knight f3. It's not knight f3. So you want to influence the center in the best way. If you play e4 now, he'll just lose the pawn. Another move is all that forcing. I mean, you could play like queen b3. That's true, but then there'd be c6. Bishop g5 now actually pins the knight. So after c6, e3, and the bishop come out. Bishop f5. Now, I'm not a big fan of bishop f5 simply because you can play queen b3 here, you see. And that pawn on b7 is undefended. Now, you can play queen b6 or queen c7, but it is possible to play bishop f5. But I think from this game, people are not going to be playing that. So now we have an immediate threat. Queen f3 on the bishop. Okay. So if we're going for refutation, we could do that. Now, bishop e4 is playable. Let me show you the engine here. Where is it? Sorry, it's right here. So let's see what Mr. Stockfish thinks. Now, here's the thing. He could play knight e4 now. Oh, sorry, not knight e4. Sorry, not knight e4. He can play bishop e4. I meant to say. Let's delete that. Delete that move. There's this bishop e4 stuff. But then, of course, we could play anyway. Well, of course, he's not going to play queen takes f6 because bishop takes. So you can play bishop takes f6. And then you have here, of course, after we exchange this off, black could continue with bishop takes f3, bishop takes d8, bishop takes g2. Now on both the bishops and the rook. We'll play bishop takes g2 now. This does support e4 push. Black will play king takes d8. And the engine's claiming that this is winning for white. Now let's look at the factors of assessing position. The first one is material. So what we have is we have one pawn island of 2, one pawn island of 3, and next pawn island of 1. So that's 2 plus 3 plus 1. That's 6 pawns. He has 7. Well, let's see. Let's see why. With white to play, why would this be winning for white? Very curious. Very curious how this would go. We'll come back to it in a moment here. So after bishop g6, he defends the bishop. Bishop takes knight, queen takes bishop, queen takes queen, pawn takes queen. And we've reached a well-known theoretical position with weak double pawns on the f-file, but up to the current game was considered playable. For black, Carlsen puts it under a serious test. This is from the annotation. And this is Machiavelsky's annotation, by the way. I'm just explaining the moves. So he plays knight f3, knight d7, knight h4, knight h4. The idea is we want to be able to control f5, so we're not going to do it right away. We're not going to exchange this off because you can play f takes, or even h takes, hitting against that h pawn with a move following up with bishop d6 castle. So white is playing for something positional. So he says a nice square for the knight from where he controls the important weak square on f5 in front of weak pawns. So he wants to control the f5 square. Bishop e7. Knight at c. No, sorry, well, there's only one knight. Knight e2. He says a clever move. Novelty from the world champion. The knight is going to g3 in order to occupy that f5 square. So what we're doing is we're looking for a slight weakness and we're trying to exploit it as much as possible. And the main move here, of course, it usually used to be g3 with the idea of bishop e2 or bishop g2. Bishop e2, knight g2, and so on. Pushing for e4 or f4, f5 idea. Black, of course, the other option is you can castle, queenside, rook c8, bishop d3, and bishop knight d6, trying to control the e4 and c4 squares. But he plays knight e2, shows a very strong positional understanding of playing a knight g3 or knight f4. But see, knight f4, though, doesn't control f5, so he'd be playing to go to g5. So knight to b6, knight to g3, as per the point here. Now here we're aiming for the f5 square, so he's going to play bishop e4 check. And as the author says, I assume this and the next move can be explained by miscalculation. The opposite color endgame, which ensues after rook to c8, knight gf5, and bishop d6. Black is fighting for the f5 square. Of course, after bishop to d3, while white is trying to keep the knight on f5, bishop takes f5. Oh, sorry, knight f5, knight takes f5, bishop takes f5. A knight takes f5 might be holdable for black, but not much fun to play. Well, you've got double pawns. You're not going to get any play on the f-file. That h pawn's going to be weak. You've got rook to g8, but what else do you have besides that? So you have to keep that in mind. So bishop e4 check is an attempt at active play. After king to d1, black now plays knight to a4 now. It looks playable at first. Of course, I do have king c2. But, yes. Actually, I don't have king c2. Okay, wait. Oh, there is this idea if you play knight takes b2. Okay. Let's check. So king c1, knight takes bishop. Pawn takes... We can actually even play f takes there. Only question is this e6 square going to be weak? If you can play a knight f4 and knight e6, I'm not sure. It seems Kramnik connected his hopes to this text but missed White's reply, knight on g to f5. Notice now we have that bishop blocked off, and we're going to have something. Just give me one moment, guys. Okay, guys. So what do you think the move is now? You see knight gf5, and now we can play king c2. So if he plays knight takes b2, play king c2. He doesn't have bishop d3 anymore, and then I'm threatened to play king b3 forking both. Believe it or not. So white is blocking the b1 to h7 diagonal, which you can see with the yellow arrow. And turns out that knight takes b2 is in white's favor. And according to Alex Berberin, king to c1 also may be playable as rook e1 is met by. Bishop to e1 is met by bishop to a6. Curious. Why would it be met by that? So play continues with king to d7. Again, knight takes b2 is strongly met with king to c2, knight to c4. And if after knight a4 we have king to b3, as I said, we're attacking both. Bishop to c3 on the rook, rook to c1 on the bishop. Now we have both under attack, which is going to be fatal. Knight to b5 now. B5. Rook takes, knight takes, and of course I believe king takes would give white 2 pieces for the pawn, or for the rook, I mean. So that's a pawn up. Other alternatives, you can play bishop takes, pawn takes, rook hb1. So a5 is possible, but after e3, or c5, but after e3, a5, rook takes b7. We're invading on the 7th rank. C takes d, e takes d, castle, knight takes g6, h takes g6, knight to e7. That is checked by the knight, king g7, rook, knight to c6, bishop b6 and a4. The idea now is a5. And despite an equal material, white obtains a demanding position. So I'm going to ask you for a moment while I close this off. It is white to play here. You guys see that thematic move here? Do you see that thematic move? Okay, let's bring this back. Doesn't quite work, does it? Hold on. Yes, the move here you would have is a4 with the idea of a5. And now you got all your pieces in the back rank. So even if white sacrificed the pawn, it'd be worth it. So after this, he plays king d7, connecting the rooks. And then he plays rook to b1. The idea is now we want to defend the b pawn, and then play a3, b4, and get a bind on the c5 square. So after the b1, and as the author put it, after the b1 h7 was blocked by the f3 knight, this move is possible. Why? Because you can't. This knight on f5 is blocking. Obviously blocking the bishop from taking the rook on b1. So he plays king e6, hitting this twice, thinking, okay, black would be happy to unblock the f5 square, of course. But Carlsen shows that it's not going to happen. After bishop d3, we've defended this twice. Now, again, he plays bishop takes f5. Best move for him is to play knight takes f5, controlling g7, h6 squares, and all these squares towards the king side. Rook h to c8. Kramnik is getting ready for the f5 pawn break because he wants some counterplay, as the author puts it. By the way, I'm quoting the author when I say that. And king e2 now. Meanwhile, Magnus connects the rooks. He connects his own rooks. Bishop to f8 and g4. Now we have a permanent bind where we've got this defended 3 times. So what we have is what's called a principle of over defense. The idea is when one of the pieces moves, it's still defended sufficiently. In this case, we want to bind on the f5 square. So here, also, you will see it's a strong and logical idea. White protects the knight on f5, like I was saying. And it's ordered to regroup the knight up to f4 by g4. So g2, the idea of f4 is where we're headed. So here he plays c5. Now c5 looks like he's getting some counterplay. He'd like to play c4 and just come down the board and double up his rooks and get counterplay. This attempt to create counterplay only worsens black's position as the d5 pawn is getting vulnerable. After knight to g2. Oh, doesn't like 19. Oh, knight g2, yeah, the idea of knight 4. Gets check, he has to come back. And according to the plan, knight is being transferred to f4 where it attacks both the king, the king on e6 and the d5 pawn. So it's starting to win material just outright with this move of knight to g2. Black is already in deep trouble, so he plays c takes d. Now the immediate bishop d6 covering the f4 square was relatively better, but black's position would remain difficult after h4. Now h4 of course threatens h5, and then black has to take, and now we've got a permanent bind on f5, which would be really bad positionally. So knight g2, c takes d, e takes d, denying access to the king to e5. So yeah, we want to keep the knight on f5, but also we want to stop him from getting the king anywhere closer. And the latter, of course, is knight f4 check. Though after knight takes d4, still leads to strategically winning position. So instead he plays in between move, just waiting and says, okay, I'm going to play the e takes d. I'm going to control the c5 and e5 squares. I still do have knight e5. Now the idea is, if he takes now, we can take back with our pawn. That's one option. Or we can take back with the bishop. Actually, sorry, take back with the bishop because this would be a skewer. Moves it and win the rook. So He can't take the bishop, the knight with his bishop anymore. E takes d, bishop takes d6, h4. Now threat is now h5. White wants to force an exchange of the light square bishops to weaken the light squares even more. Now black is now forced to play h5 because after after h5 either he's going to lose the bishop or he's going to lose the exchange by if he takes with bishop takes knight, where white would recapture, skewer the king, and then win the rook, winning the exchange. Black is now forced to play h5, and Kramnik is trying to undermine the knight on f5, but Carlsen finds a way to secure the square even without the g pawn. He now plays knight g7. It's very much a timing issue. Now we got the king has to come back. Then we play pawn takes pawn. Now here's the deal. He can't recapture because he'll lose the exchange. Now black is forced to trade the light square bishop. So bishop takes d3, king takes d3. From where he attacks d5 and controls the f5 square. Knight goes back to b6, and he plays knight g4. Why? We've got a weak pawn on f6. Now he could play at king f6 now. Or excuse me, king e7, which is what he played. Now the f6 pawn is a target. So excuse me, he plays rook h8, not king f6. Okay, wants to get some counter. You could try to play king e7 at this point. Let's see what happens. Let's look at this king e7 idea, because it's kind of critical at this point. King e7, knight c6. You know what? I need to move this all the way over. Okay, king e7, rook h3 with the idea of rook e3. And that's going to be quite bad. Okay. Let's move this back to where it was. Let's remove the kibitzer. Okay. So knight g4 now on the pawn. Now he has to give up the pawn. He wants to play for counterplay with rook h8, but after that we have rook he1. You say, okay, what's the big deal? Well, we're going to permanently own the e file. And now you cannot, well, even without the rook on e1, you still cannot take on h5 because there would be the fork on f6. So, such as rook takes h5, knight takes f6, working the king and the rook. Not only would this exchange pawn, but later I'd win the exchange. And then after that, we're going to play like h5, h6, h7 type stuff. So it's going to be very strong. And also, of course, no rush. First, the king is denied its access to the e-file. Although knight takes f6, check, king e7, and knight takes g4 doesn't spoil anything, but there's no rush to take it, so why take it? Rook h e1, bishop e7, and f5, knight f5. Now we are starting to play rook takes e7 check. So after rook takes h7, rook takes e7 check. Right. And after that, of course, we can play knight takes f6, hitting the rook. Keep in mind that the f5 square, the f5 knight is defending the pawn on h4. So the author says the knight is coming back to f5 with tempo. So he plays bishop d8, h6. White fully dominates here. The rest is a matter of not very difficult technique. So he plays rook to c8. So his suggested analysis is rook c8, rook bc1, knight to d6, hitting the f5 knight will be replaced with his friend on g4. So basically you can play knight to e3 now. And then that will be all it is. After b3, we're cutting off the squares on c4 and e4 now. There's no knight jumps, there's no rook. We control the e-file. I'm pretty much squeezing the life out of the position. Of course, white's restricting the b6 knight, as I said before. So after rook to c6, rook at g to e3. Notice we're also hitting the pawn on d5, but also solidifying the knight on f5. Now, white is connecting his knights and puts pressure on d5 in order to prevent the b6 knight from moving. So in this case, as the game continues, it plays bishop c7, rook on b to c1. Now here, where the knight's on e3, we want to focus on the c file. Okay. There's nothing more you can really do. Technically, we could trade off and still win, but probably don't want to trade immediately because we want to keep this d5 square as weak as possible. The idea now would be a4, a5. Although we can play a5, we in turn would weaken the knight a little bit. So rook bc1, exchanging black's only active piece. So in this case, problem is if you let white take, he'll take back, I believe, with the pawn. Can't take with the knight because with the king, because the knight will go to e7. Then you will win. Well, king d6. You eventually will win the d5 pawn. So rook takes rook, rook takes rook. Now bishop f4 tries to hit this pawn on h4. White now plays rook to c5, and then we're hitting that d pawn twice. So the idea is if he takes the knight on e3, we take back with the knight on f5. If we take with the pawn on for example, on h6, we simply do have knight takes d5, and even the idea of playing knight takes f6. So white will come out of it. Even if black wins that pawn, he'll still come out of it in the negative. So as the author says, exchanging the h6 pawn for the d5 pawn, which won't be worth it. And that's best case scenario for black. So we play rook to c5, king to e6, knight g7 check, king d6, and knight to g4. Now again, we're defending that pawn on h6, but also we're threatening to play knight takes f6. Now, notice we don't have the e5 or g5 squares, so what is this bishop going to do? Well, he can try to come up, play, and can't even play bishop h2, so it's pretty much cut off. And as he says, a clever comeback. Now the h6 pawn is untouchable. So, so for example, you take now, right? Let's say you take on h6. Knight takes h6, rook takes h6. Then we have the knight f5 check, forking the king and the rook. Alternatively, black could have played king e7 to defend the pawn. Then we play rook e2, king d8, and knight f5. Now we got a double defense on that. Plus, we have ideas of coming into the position on e7, g7, and the position is going to get worse. And as the author puts it, is another position of full domination. Excuse me. So, rook c2 and f5, trying to get rid of the weakness. So as the author says, it's an attempt to get relief that doesn't help. So as I said, king e7, rook e2, rook d8, and rook f5, and another is domination, as I said as well. So at f5, he plays knight takes f5 anyway. It's a question of how do you want me to take the pawn. Knight takes f5, king e6, knight g7 check, king d6, and rook to e2 now. We are permanently controlling that the e file, and giving options to play like knight e6, knight e8, giving the check, and the king goes farther and farther away while the other king is getting closer. That would be king c6 now, rook e8. Actually, even stronger because once this rook comes off the board, that h pawn is going to roll down the board for queen. So he actually does take it. But the thing is, what option does he have? If he plays rook h7, what do you do? So rook, yeah, and then And I think there's also this idea of playing rook e7 and then winning the pawn, and then it gets worse. Rook takes, knight f8. The idea now is he wants to stop the pawn from coming to h7. Knight e5 check. Now we're threatening a fork on the f7 square, so he has to take. Bishop takes, pawn takes. Now we have king d7. So now you see, because the pawn on e5 is covering the f6 square, and also we have king d4 defending the pawn as well. So white can just simply go to f6, check, king e6. And now, believe it or not, we have a beautiful move on the board. We have h5. Now, it doesn't look great until you realize that black has no squares. For with h5, the only question is, if he plays king takes e5, oh right, king takes e5, we have knight e7, forking the king and the knight. And then I would take the knight, and then I push the pawn. Yes, that's beautiful. I like that h5 move. So now he's completely cut off. King takes pawn, and this is exactly what happens after h5. But the problem is, I'm going to win the knight, or I'm going to come down with h7. Can't stop it from queening. Knight to c5 check and king e2. There's no more checks. There's no more nothing. I'm going to queen on the next move. So you can see the domination of this. The idea now is white found a weakness. If we go back from the beginning, what caused all this? Well, white found a weakness after this exchange on the f5 square. So not only did we have double pawns and isolated pawns, but these pawns being doubled, what you do is you put a pawn, you blockade the pawn, and then you start attacking it. So once it's blockaded, it can't move, it becomes weak. So he found that this double pawn not only is weak, but also that he can't do anything about the pawn in front of it, which makes it a double weakness. So he just attacks the bishop as it came out. See, that's why they don't play bishop f5 like that. They'll play something like knight b d7, playing a very solid bishop e7, very solid chess castle, then do it. But the idea is if I take, he can take back with a knight. Okay, so that's the idea. But but with the bishop coming out instead, so bishop g5. Okay, now the idea behind behind bishop f5 is the fact that he wants to get the knight out and not blockaded behind the knight, but that would be on d7 if he moves on knight at b to d7. But the problem is it becomes a weakness because it's hard to guard that. So instead, after that, he comes back and takes and takes. See how we have the double pawns, and this bishop also is not good. So you have all these weaknesses. So when he plays this forward, he just said, okay, I'm going to focus on the f5 square. How do I do it? I get two knights to cover that square. You don't have anything that can oppose it, so he just said, okay, knight g. He plays knight c2, nice move. Even on knight b6, we just play knight to g3. Now we're gonna cover that f5 square. So if he takes with this bishop, we're gonna have a permanent weakness on f5 because nothing can contest it. I mean, you'd literally have to bring your king all the way to e7, in which case I have g4, or you can play g4 to g5, but then still, it's not that simple. Also, I can play bishop d3. So I noticed that he tried some counterplay. King just said, okay, there's nothing open over there. We're just going to calmly block that square. We're going to realize, okay, you can't really take on b2 because of the fact I've got king c2, knight has to move, and then see these pieces might get forked. Where's the piece going to go? So the best idea was to address the weakness over on the f5 square, but it created such a weakness that it was strategically quite a bit better for white. So even after this king stuff, he just said, okay, let me consolidate that. We block that off, and then later on we play rook b1, not a problem. Center's closed. We can keep the king in the center. And what we did was we stopped him from coming to b2 by playing rook b1. I said, okay, that's great. Then we bring out our last piece to solidify that f5 square. Because now after king e6, guess what happens? We've got to defend that twice. So, and then he tries to open up the c file. Notice that with this king e2 move, which is good, is that we're connecting the rooks. We can contest the c file. But then the problem is, what are these bishops doing? So there's no real good plan for black, but white can keep improving his position by putting that knight on h4 all the way to f4. Okay, so when there's no tactics, the idea is you want to look at the worst placed piece on the board and you want to improve it. So if you can't just go to the best square right away, you want to think, okay, in 2 or 3 moves, where's the best square? Okay, g4, we're going to defend that a third time. Over defend it, so when he plays knight g2, we'll keep it there. Notice that bishop takes cannot be played because bishop takes will take back on f5, and you would skewer the king. So it'd be check, king would move, and you'd play bishop takes rook, and that'd be more than sufficient to win, being up the exchange. So he plays c takes d. Now remember, he played e takes d. We want to control the e5 square, so the king cannot come up. And the idea is we're cutting off squares where the king can go to. Notice the bishop also is cutting off the c2 square. The rook cannot go to c4, c3, c2, or c1. So where does he go? Well, he can't go to c5, so c6, c7, or c8. Problem with the c8 now is your rook on a8 is out of play. So it gets in its way. So what he did was, white just continued with his plan. His advantage was on the king side, played on the king side, plays h4. Notice that bishop on g6 has nowhere to go after g4. So that's the thing. So again, if you play bishop takes knight, we play bishop takes bishop, that's check, and you win the rook. So h4 now threatens to play h5 because now the bishop is on a bad square. That's the problem with this opening is, although it looks aggressive, although it looks good, you bring out a piece too soon where it's not clear where its best square is. Like, if you can't keep a piece on a good square, then it's not the best square. So h5 now. Plays knight g5 check. So after that, when the king moves, now we've won the pawn. Even when he trades this off still, he has nothing on the light squares anymore. What can go on the light squares? Okay, his rook can go to c4 now, but that can change, remember? So king's going to come back. We have knight e3. Now, notice also we have a weak pawn on d5. So you notice he moves his other knight out. So okay, we're going to defend it, but then we go back to where it is. So we feign to attack on the center while we go to the king side. And then, because we have those double pawns, when he plays knight g4, it comes with a threat. So rook h8. Problem is, it's kind of like too little too late, because actually you can't even really take on h5, so it's almost pointless to do that. Because we're going to take on f6, and then we're going to win that rook on h5 if he decides to take the pawn h5. So there really is no threat. Like rook takes a and actually right now even then, what do you have? Because the thing is, actually, if you play rook g8 to attack my knight, I just play h6. So what do you have? So that's kind of the problem. Yeah. And then what you can actually do is play h7. They still can't take because we have the fork. So what we do is we have no more threats for black, so we're going to control that last file was on the e file. Notice, if you move a rook, that rook over to e8, I'll just lose the exchange. Okay, so and then you can swing the other rook over, and we got a pass pawn. It's going to be severely bad. So he switches back to the king side where he is. And then we say, okay, we've got control. Now that we've got control in the h file, he doesn't have any counterplay on the queen side. What we're going to do is we're going to play knight f5, and then we're going to threaten to take on e7. So after bishop d8, because now we're attacking it, white's now attacking it twice. Notice we're just keep moving the knights closer. Okay, what's the only square you can go to with the knight? Okay, c4. Okay, we're not in a rush to take on f5, the f pawn. Why? Nothing can guard it. Well, the bishop's guarding it, but take care of his only threat when he plays b3 to stop bishop to c4. So you can see. Then after that, what we do is once you've settled that threat, we now look at the pawn that's weak on d5. Now it is guarded once, however, but when we look into the game, look, we're trading off his, and then because we have the rooks connected, he only has one active piece, which of course is that rook. So we trade off his active rook. You see, and then what we did, we just kept. Then finally, after we traded off, we're going to put our rook into play, attack that pawn twice. Remember from the game, you cannot play. Now you cannot play bishop takes h6 because I'll take, and when he takes back with a rook, we have knight f5. Or we can even see the bishop takes h6, knight takes. Or even for that matter, I can just play knight takes d5, and then I can play. Yeah, we take here. If he does something, we take again, and then we come back to h5. Check. He has to go to dark square. Then we take back. He takes, and then we have the fork. Notice now knight g4 for sure cannot take because there's going to be we're going to be able to fork him with knight f5. But the main thing is, even if you give up, you're happy to give up the h pawn for the t pawn. Even then. But now you can't because we have the fork on f5 at the end of the combination. So his only thing is to give it up by trying to tempo the knight, but then we just give it up. Then we just take his knight, take his pawn, with check, which tempos it. Then we go back to the regular square. Then he goes to d6, and then of course rook e2. Again, we're controlling e file. We're going back to e2, which is natural because we're not going to do anything on the c file. It was only the threat and the pawn on d5. Then we do have something like rook e8, or actually, rook e8 is probably even stronger in a way, yeah. Because if the rooks come off the board, what's going to stop the h pawn? Notice that the f6 square is covered by the knight on g4. Okay, so once I play h5, you're not going to play bishop e5 because I can just take. There's nothing to stop it. So now we are threading rook e8, which knight f6 would just cost you a piece, and we're still going to play rook e8. So from here, it's almost resignable because you can't really stop this rook e8 threat, because once that rook is diverted or deflected, then that h pawn wins. So you can see he tries to stop it with the knight, and even with black's best play, getting rid of one of those pieces. What do we have? We have the check again. We have notice he doesn't play h7. He plays h5. So this is what they call in German a Schusswang, which means there's no moves or no good moves left over. I mean, he can push these pawns on the queen side, but what's happening? I'm going to play h5 now. h7. He doesn't have knight g6 to counterattack here. And then, if he takes the pawn, we have this knight d7 deflection sacrifice, where if he plays knight takes d7, we play h7, and then h8 cannot be stopped for the queen. So what we're doing is we're taking away squares, and obviously not knight h7 because knight takes knight. So really can't stop him from going forward. Notice he plays king takes e5, which is kind of a blunder, but there's not much you can do. Then we have the beautiful knight d7 deflection sacrifice. with check. So he has to do something, otherwise he'll win the knight, and that pawn rolls up the board. Or possibly two pawns roll up the board. A7, knight c5 check, king e2. And this is where I think this idea of bishop f5 was at least temporarily refuted, because it became such a weakness where you lose time, you don't have squares on good pieces, and then I say, okay, fine, I'm going to go after that d pawn. The key thing was, the reason why I could go after is because he traded it early, was c takes d. Now normally this wouldn't be great because you let the bishop out. However, we're focusing on that d5 square with the move like bishop g5, you see. And then we just play e3, get our bishop out. And then, I mean, it's not losing or even any significantly worse by black having to take that pawn back, but bishop f5 I think was refuted. So I noticed he didn't play knight g2 or any of those moves. He played queen f3. Okay, so I believe so. Bishop e4. Have to look at the engines with all this, but let's look at the engine's idea about this. Because one idea is bishop e4. So if bishop e4, what does white play? He plays bishop takes f6 on the queen. Now bishop can take back. Sorry, you can play queen takes, but then of course I'm going to play knight takes e4. And after d takes e4, we simply are up a pawn. With queen takes e4 with check, so that can't be great. Alternatively, after knight takes e4, he could play. Yeah, he could play queen takes f3 here. We're going to take back with the pawn. Why? Because after d takes t, after d takes e, we'll play f takes e, and we will be up a pawn for sure. So, we will control these squares around there. We can even play bishop h3 there to control the long diagonal, and we get our knight out, knight g3 or f3, and then do a minority attack with a4, a5, b4, b5, move the rook over, etc. So after bishop d4, bishop takes. Alternatively, he could play bishop takes f3, and then I will of course take his queen, and then bishop takes g2. Bishop takes g2. Okay, let's see. King takes. Now let's count how many pieces. We have 3 pieces versus 2. So that means we're up the exchange. And even when I count how many pawns, at 6 pawns versus 7, we're up a knight versus 1 of his pawns. So he has an extra pawn, but we have an extra one. So we're up the exchange. So yeah, really the only realistic move is bishop g6. You can see how bishop f5 is just not correct. Notice that the engine doesn't even consider it. And I don't think I would ever consider that, even though it looks aggressive because it's trying to play along the diagonal, like that 5 to b1 diagonal. But there's better moves. The idea is you don't want to create any pawn weaknesses and bring out another piece. I play solidly so if he takes, you take back with a knight. And then you play bishop e7. Black's position is solid enough, it's not a big deal. After he castles and stuff, he wants to play on the e-file. Meanwhile, white will be playing for an idea like a4, or even a3, b4, b5, or a4, rook b1, b4, b5. This is called a minority attack. So, anyway, with that said, hopefully you enjoyed. This was a very instructive version about how to play and winning the middle game with the Queen's Gambit exchange. I'll be having more middle game strategy talked about from famous games, and you can actually learn from other players' games and see how they played it out. And this will give you the right form and the right strategy for how to play out your games. Excuse me. So with that said, I would like to thank you for taking the time to watch this video. You could be watching any other chess videos. There's lots of them. There's grandmasters, a lot of people, lots of good videos out on YouTube and even on Rumble as well. But I wanted to make a series that I don't see very many people doing. And while the opening is important to set up a decent position, you don't want to have a disadvantage out of the opening. But to understand, you can play a simple move like the exchange variation and have the right plan behind it and know how to play it out. And you can see here the proof that it actually works. So stay tuned for part 2 of my series. And it's going to be several fold for this series. Okay, so stay tuned. So if you haven't already, please click the subscribe button. That way I'll have access to all my chess content on this channel, as I certainly do have a variety of content on this channel for you to view and enjoy. So I'll have this uploaded to my YouTube and also to my Rumble as well. So for my Rumble channel, I'll give you the link to my Rumble channel, and I will give you the name of my Rumble channel, which is Global Product and Gaming Review. It will be in the comments. Okay, so go ahead and look. I also have other content on that for for my Rumble. I have it consolidated where I have all games and stuff versus YouTube. People are more interested in having it more specialized, so I have it for different demographics and different ways and means for different demographics. That is. Excuse me. Also, if you haven't already, go ahead and please click the bell button on my channel. That way you won't miss any of my new videos that come out because you'll be notified accordingly. So go ahead and click that bell button. So I'd like to wish you a great day wherever you are. Happy New Year's. Get some rest. Look forward to a great 2025. Relax and enjoy, and may your chess games go better every time you play.